Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We're looking at the evolution of colonial New England, the metamorphosis, how they became so successful from an economic standpoint. They lived under an economic system known as mercantilism. And last week, as an introduction to mercantilism, we looked at some of the isms we're familiar with in our day. Focusing primarily on capitalism, we focused on what the political economics of capitalism requires for success, but also how society benefits from it. The key points that we want to understand is that a free market system, capitalism, requires independence. The economy is driven by personal interest. It's not subject to central planning. It requires and encourages personal property rights. It supports and strengthens many of the liberties that we enjoy in the USA. The freedoms and liberties are, in many ways, byproducts of capitalism. No system is perfect, but if we are measuring and evaluating a system by what it allows, what it produces, and how much autonomy people living and making decisions based on their own self-interest, and of course, what kind of profits or excess it produces, capitalism eclipses all other isms. And if you recall, Kiss's Gene Simmons said, "Capitalism is the best thing that ever happened to human beings. The welfare state sounds wonderful, but it doesn't work." Vladimir Putin said, quote, "Many European countries are witnessing a rise of the dependency mentality when not working is often much more beneficial than working. This type of mentality endangers not only the economy, but also the moral basics of society," end quote. And former leftist president of Brazil, and again, all apologies if I butcher this name, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, said, quote, "It was necessary to first build capitalism, then make socialism. We must have something to distribute before doing so," end quote. And lastly, we quoted a few times from Bono of U2, who's an active anti-poverty warrior. He said, quote, "Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid," end quote. And again, he said, "Capitalism is not immoral, it's amoral. It requires our instruction," end quote. According to Forbes's Mark Hendrickson, there is an inconvenient truth for those opposed to capitalism. He says, quote, "Economic history shows that some approaches work better than others when it comes to economic development. In terms of what people in one country can do to assist the economic development of another. It turns out that foreign trade and foreign investment contribute significantly to economic development, while foreign aid does not," end quote. By this, he said that data, real, substantive, quantifiable data, not emotion and not opinion, verifiable actions and reactions can be measured and quantified. He also said, quote, "Foreign aid, in contrast to trade and investment, has a dismal record. Countries that have received large aid packages have largely remained poor. Two World Bank studies attribute this to the fact that foreign aid often props up regimes that govern poorly. Statistics have shown that most aid-dependent countries have averaged slightly negative economic growth, leaving them mired in poverty. Aid isn't the answer," end quote. Again, he uses real data from a recognized third party. The immorality charge against capitalism might be better leveled at people. If the goal is to actually solve a problem, that is. I mean, it does need to be tamed. It needs to be instructed. We took that field trip as an exercise to begin to draw our attention to the concept of wealth, how it's made. The idea being that there are many ways, many more than our own experience has shown us. Also to underscore the idea that when we begin to talk about wealth, either of nations or individuals, the contemporary philosophies would be foreign to the colonists. And conversely, their philosophy is foreign to us. Well, kind of. There are shades of it, remnants of it. If not in name, certainly in mild, recognizable forms. That system is mercantilism. It was the system that had been developing for a century in Europe and was a major motivator for colonialism as the modern nation-states were born, and competition among the states of Europe increased. So what is it? How did it function? What were its tenets? That's what we want to identify today. And I would like to briefly define mercantilism, develop it practically with a real-life example from the 17th century, and then look at an example of what it can look like. An illustration from a very famous colonial event told from a slightly different angle than we're used to. I think it will reframe the event, but also serve to underscore the concept of mercantilism, its strengths and its shortcomings. And this will just be a primer. We'll spend a few weeks developing the system as utilized by the colonials. And again, like capitalism, we'll want to develop a working knowledge and understanding of mercantilism. This overview is not intended to be comprehensive, and I will be generalizing. Most of these points will be revisited in real historical context over the next several months. So, mercantilism can be a slippery term to define. There's no definite one-size-fits-all model. The term itself was never used by its original proponents. It was a system first coined, mercantilism, by the Marquis de Mirabeau in 1763, and later, in 1776, popularized by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is a basic primer of classical economics. And it was largely a rebuttal of mercantilism. In this, then, we have our first clue as to how to articulate mercantilism. If Adam Smith was abdicating a laissez-faire, a hands-off approach to the government intervention of the economy, then mercantilism represents the opposite. First off, the mindset of the colonial world was that resources and wealth are finite. Therefore, as the rise of the nation-states gained traction, the goal was for you or your nation to get the biggest piece of that pie. Trade was seen as a zero-sum game. In order to win, someone had to lose. If you lost, it meant somebody beat you. So under mercantilism, the nation tried to increase exports and decrease imports. They tried to be as self-sufficient as possible with their own needs and as needed as possible for other nations. So, put another way, quote, it is an economic practice by which governments used their economies to augment state power at the expense of other countries, end quote. Or you could say it's the economic theory that trade generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism. The goal was to obtain as much gold and silver as possible, and that accumulation of gold and silver would make a nation rich and powerful. Colonies were seen as seedbeds for natural resources. They could send those back to the mother country and also be a built-in market for finished goods. So a global presence was very desirable, each area contributing diverse raw materials and markets. So Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England colonized the world. The flip side, another benefit was that you prevented other nations from acquiring those natural resources. You wanted to control those resources because then they would have to depend on you to supply their needs, thus transferring wealth from their account to yours. Taxes, tariffs, trade embargoes were all tools. The buildup of strong standing armies and national navies were the means to the ends at this time. Remember, way back in some of the very first episodes of this podcast, when we developed the Tudor dynasty, we talked about Henry VII and then his son Henry VIII, who were the first guys to realize that if England had a strong national navy, their island nation could prevent invasion by basically preventing anybody from being able to actually get there, right? Before that, navies were largely private, and they were used in times of national emergency, but they weren't kept full-time. That's expensive. Well, with mercantilism, the necessity of those national navies was obvious, but so was the necessity for a permanent, professional, state-controlled army. It was their job to protect the raw materials in faraway lands, as well as the homeland, national interest as opposed to personal. Mercantilism encouraged hostilities and war between rival nations, as well as slavery and servitude. This led to higher profits, it was believed, although especially today when the counter-arguments can be verified with historical illustrations, that may not actually be the case. But anyway, so just from this small view, we can see the difference between a capitalist system, which emphasizes personal interest and profit, focusing on supply and demand, and mercantilism, which emphasizes national wealth with strong government oversight and regulations to promote industry the way the government sees it. That's why there's not one clean, neat model for mercantilism. Nations use a variety of methods to achieve their best possible outcome. The debate has always been just how much government control is necessary. Adam Smith charged mercantilists with strict controls, while others of his day disagreed. But there's no disagreement that subsidies, government-backed monopolies, and protectionism were in use. As a side note, there have been men, good men, prominent men on all sides of these issues. John Locke and David Hume were antagonists to mercantilism long before Adam Smith. As a matter of fact, David Hume argued against the prospect of a constant positive balance, or more exports than imports, of trade by illustrating that as bullion was acquired by one nation and the supply rose, the value would decrease in proportion to other goods. And so too, conversely, in a nation that was exporting bullion, its value would rise as it became more scarce, eventually affecting the cost effectiveness of exporting goods from the high-priced country to the low-priced country. And the balance of trade would then reverse. So, drawing again from our example from last week when we talked about capitalism, the anti-mercantilists were arguing the comparative advantage. Men like David Ricardo, long before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. The classic illustration is the trade between England and Portugal, or what it could have looked like. Portugal was a more efficient producer of wine than England. England was better at cloth production. And that's a focus that we're going to revisit multiple times over the course of our study of colonial America. At any rate, the Portuguese make really good wine. The English are really good at producing cloth. If England concentrated on cloth and Portugal concentrated on wine, they could trade, each producing a high-value commodity, with both nations winning. Thus, trade did not have to be a zero-sum game. Further, the value of a good, how much another good or service it exchanges for in the marketplace, is proportional to how much labor was required to produce it. Now, by labor, we mean labor, but also raw materials, machinery, the whole cost of producing whatever widget that happens to be. The result in that scenario would be that everyone gets richer. That's the free market model of personal self-interest and profits to stimulate economies. Now, all of these things seem obvious in our day, but we have the hindsight of centuries of economic activity on a global scale. This was not so cut and dry back then. The English embraced Adam Smith. Although it's kind of weird, they embraced Adam Smith, but they had by that time a global empire that was running on mercantilism. Maybe it was by another name, but as Shakespeare once said, a rose by any other name is still a rose, right? But closer to home, here in America, men like Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln disagreed with Adam Smith. So we wanted to point these things out because there are differences in these systems. And if we really want to understand colonial America and the economic development, I think it's important that we understand that, because so many of the events that we'll be looking at were instigated, at least in part, by mercantilism. So the question is, what does the current U.S. economic strategy look like when we're talking about these things? Is it free market or protectionist? Are we a capitalist nation? What's the right formula? A lot of our national politics revolves around these very questions, don't they? So in reality, the U.S. has always had a mixed economy. That is to say, a great deal of personal interest and focus on profit, but also government regulation, subsidies, taxes, and tariffs. I'm not sure any one system can be used as a standalone system. There are too many variables between nations, regions, populations, disbursement of natural resources and raw materials. Anyway, let's not get too far down into those weeds. Eventually, post-Adam Smith, a lot of people did come to realize that mercantilism did have some things to offer. And still later down the timeline, John Maynard Keynes supported some facets of mercantilism. Adam Smith had argued that goods, populations, and institutions were the impetuses of wealth. Keynes believed that the money supply, trade balances, and interest rates were important considerations. Smith looked at consumption. Keynes stressed production, at least realizing a focus on production was necessary. So government intervention is necessary. In the end, mercantilism created competition between nations. It helps to pick winners and losers and benefited the state most of all. So you can see how this study of the Puritan economy will actually apply quite nicely in a lot of ways to our contemporary considerations, both political and economic, in the world that we live in today. I mean, we are still having the same conversations and the same arguments hundreds of years later. Mercantilism was not just for the English. I mean, as we've said, not by a long shot. The political career of Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Colbert provides a great illustration of what mercantilism can provoke, what it can do, and what it can offer to a society. His particular flavor of mercantilism is aptly labeled Colbertism. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was born in 1619. He had a long career. He had, metaphorically, big, busy hands that left fingerprints all over the French society and government. He arrived on the scene after the Renaissance had rejected many of the religious views of medieval Europe and feudalism had failed. Remember, some of the most prominent Englishmen, like Ferdinand Gorges, the anti-Puritan pro-Anglican powerhouse, as well as many of the Puritans, like Lord Say and Seal of Saybrook, were looking to colonize other areas with a feudalistic approach. The European economic atmosphere was ripe for change. And Jean-Baptiste was just the guy France needed. He was a student of foreign trade and economic theories, but he was no armchair observer. He was an implementer and a doer. Over the course of his career, he served as Secretary of the Navy, building a world-class Navy. He supported the arts and sciences. He built roads and bridges and canals for commercial transport. And he modernized Paris. And he encouraged French colonization of Canada, even playing a critical role in the development of industry in the colony. He served as France's Controller General of Finance, and here is where he made a huge impact. Not that advancing the arts or building a navy and encouraging global growth of France was chump change, but as Controller General, he stabilized financial operations internally. He reformed taxation. He reorganized industry and commerce. He was a protectionist. He helped reinvent the nation. He helped make France the wealthiest nation in Europe. But that's not all. Actions, like ideas, have consequences, and there were consequences to Colbert's ideas. His energy to propel France forward came at the expense of other nations. The Franco-Dutch War of 1672 to 1678 had a lot to do with trying to knock the Dutch down a peg and elevate the French, and he was behind that. The Dutch were globally successful. They needed to be dealt with. There were a lot of twists and turns to this one. I mean, not many years before, the Dutch were the envy of Europe with a superior navy. But by 1672, England and France had made significant headway. This war pitted France, England, Cologne, and Munster against the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Brandenburg, Prussia, Lorraine, Denmark, Norway, and Spain. It's like a mini world war. Oh, and oddly enough, at the end, 1678, England had switched sides. So when the war had started, because of French aggression in 1672, England and the Dutch were fighting the Third Anglo-Dutch War. They fought that until 1674. At that point, England joined the French side. But again, by the time 1678 had rolled around, England jumped in on the Dutch side. I mean, a little bit of opportunism there. So let's just unpack a little what was going on here. In the context of our current conversation, mercantilism and colonialism, think about the nations that were involved. Think about the picture that I just laid out for you. These guys collectively were only a few generations removed from everybody being under the banner of the Roman Catholic Church. Wars were fought for territory, money, power, but they were measured. This war engulfed all of Northern Europe. The Dutch, who had fought 80 years against the Spanish, now allied with them because a weak Spain was more appealing than a strong France. And the English and the Dutch had basically, you remember multiple episodes we talked about this, basically had ensured mutual continued existence against the French, the Spanish, the Holy Roman Empire for most of the last 100 years. And now they were fighting their third war. And there would be another Anglo-Dutch war at the time of the American Revolution, a separate but parallel war. I don't know if you realize that. It does go to show the might of the Netherlands, though, in times past. the might and the global reach. They and their allies fought the 17th century dream team of a temporary Franco-Anglo alliance. The result of this war was pretty carnal on the continent. Between the two sides, there were almost 350,000 total deaths as a direct result of the fighting. That's a lot. Anyway, all this fighting, all these alliances and betrayals, all these decisions were based on national interest, financial and economic interest. This was a different animal than other wars, typical warfare in Europe, that were fought along religious lines. Even the 30 Years' War had begun that way. That's when the shift had occurred. You remember we talked about this a while ago. What began largely along religious lines ended with an alliance between Catholic France to curb the Habsburgs and the powerful Protestants of Sweden. Now, 25 years later, alliances were forged on the continent between financial interests. Alliances were formed for national interest, and they could quickly shift and change. This was a new era in Europe. The era of finance and personal national interests had arrived, and so too, almost continually, brutal war in the quest for national treasure. These wars were largely instigated by mercantilist policies. They added a certain instability to the European neighborhood. So, back in England, they had their own approach, their own flavor and application of mercantilism. They saw their colonies as moneymakers for the motherland. It was England's coffers that were to be filled. What was best for the local economy was not always a consideration. There were joint stock companies, companies that were owned by private investors for profit. The English East India Company, known by several names over the years, was formed in 1600 under Elizabeth I. They were basically formed as a monopoly trading company in India and Asia and Africa and eventually all the way to the Persian Gulf. That's a big area. They became an extension of the British government and its interests. Partially state-owned, and they were certainly indebted to the government. Now, hold tight, because as we end out our time today, this will all come back around and it'll make sense why I'm telling you this. But at any rate, the English East India Company competed sometimes violently with the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch. They ruled large areas administratively and militarily. I mean, they basically had like their own military. At one time, it's estimated that they controlled half the world's trade. So when we talk about the East India Company, we're not talking about some small joint stock company. We're talking about a mammoth, monolithic, like almost too big to imagine type of trading company. I think in their day, they would have been considered too big to fail. And the government was very much invested in their enterprise. They controlled cotton, silk, indigo, dye, sugar, salt, spices, opium, and tea. And that's where our story will find its root. The concept of too big to fail and the monopoly that the English East India Company had over tea. Now, add to that consideration that the colonies themselves were very tightly controlled. There were limits on what the colonies could produce. There were rules about which ships they could use. They were told who they could and who they could not trade with. There were times of inflation and high taxation within the colonial network, based on what the mother country needed. Conversely, there were laws like the Navigation Acts, first implemented in 1651 to discourage foreign countries like the Netherlands from trading with the colonies. But those Navigation Acts also chewed up and spit out the colonies themselves. They were supposed to work through England. All trade was to be carried out on either English or colonial ships. No Dutch shipping was to go directly to any English colony. This led to the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. The Navigation Act of 1660 created further restrictions. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, wool, indigo, and ginger were only to be shipped to England or an English colony. This restricted a lot of trade for the American colonies, who could not trade directly with anyone, even close neighbors, not legally. It led to smuggling, cheaper, easier commodities for them, and reduced taxes and markets for finished goods for England. So there were more laws passed, like the Plantation Duty Act of 1673. You see how this whole situation could easily mushroom out of control. England against the colonies against England, England against foreign nations. In 1696, there was another Navigation Act passed. We always seem to think that the Navigation Acts were something new in the 60s. Not the case. So at any rate, there was another Navigation Act that was passed, which even further suppressed commerce for the colonies. This act proclaimed, quote, "No goods or merchandise whatsoever shall be imported to or exported out of any colony or plantation to His Majesty in Asia, Africa, or America, except in ships built in England, Ireland, or a colony or plantation." The ship's crews were to be made up of no less than 3/4 of the people of these places. The penalty for violating this act was forfeiture of cargo and vessel. I mean, there's a lot of protection for the English East India Company, isn't there? That's the epitome of protectionism and cronyism. You can only use ships that are built in England, Ireland, or a colony. The crew of that ship had to be 3/4 from one of those areas. And if you violated that act, you'd forfeit not just the cargo, but the vessel itself. So is this anywhere near the idea of free trade? I mean, how inconvenient, not to mention inefficient for the colonists. Also, if you played by these rules, you'd pay higher taxes for that inconvenience. It's easy to see why colonial America began to smuggle and trade illegally with their closest foreign neighbors, almost from out of the gate. It's also easy to see how this could provoke foreign nations against England, creating a vicious cycle of tension, more smuggling, and war. Another tool used was the Writs of Assistance. These were general search warrants given to customs officers that allowed them to search ships, shops, and homes, warehouses, where illegal or smuggled goods might be hidden. The key word there is might. They first appeared in England in 1662 and in the colonies in 1696. These are familiar terms if you're even remotely acquainted with the years prior to the Revolutionary War. It's interesting to note that many of the laws the colonial Americans ignored or protested and later rebelled against had been on the books and or in practice for nearly a century or more. You also begin to see the origins and instigators of some of the rights and privileges that we enjoy that are enshrined in our founding documents, like the Fourth Amendment that reads, quote, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." End quote. As far as privileges ingrained in our society, the idea that trade and commerce is not infringed upon by the government in normal circumstances, you begin to understand how and why the modern political economic policies were being shaped generations before they were ever realized, let alone codified in our legal code. In my mind, we might want to revisit these concepts on a national level in these most unstable times. You may enjoy your political rival being harassed, but what happens when the precedent is set and the pendulum of power swings and it's you that suffers unreasonable search and seizures? The system was designed by men who had a recent history of abuse, either individually or societally. We're not as sensitive to the pernicious nature of governmental abuse and overreach, because until recently, it hasn't been as openly, unapologetically practiced. Our system is strong when it's respected, but it's very brittle if disrespected. I mean, put another way, if a generation of leaders arises in the United States that pay little to no heed to the spirit of our system, we're all in jeopardy. Anyway, it's in this political and commercial climate that I want to talk about one more example before we move on and close out today. Ties all of these things together. This one would occur about 100 years later. Maybe you could say it was the right bookend to the Franco-Dutch War in the day of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. It had to do with the global tea market. It took place in North America and was not an international incident. It was an internal English problem. By this time, mercantilism had run its course in a lot of ways. A century of almost constant warfare had taken its toll as well. By the time the 7 Years' War in Europe and its North American counterpart, the French and Indian War, had ended in the 1750s and 60s, England had some serious financial difficulties. The war in North America between France and England had basically been provoked by the colonials. It had been very expensive, and Parliament was looking for ways to recoup their losses. So how does any government raise money? Taxes. There were plenty of efforts made through taxation to raise the necessary funds to pay the debts. They had the Navigation Acts and Writs of Assistance, along with a host of other taxes. And we won't take the time to develop the details too much here because we're attempting to define and illustrate the mercantile system, its basic premise, and its consequences. There will be time for more in-depth discussions when we get to this time frame. So anyway, by the early 1770s, a decade of haggling over these various taxes had tired everybody out. One of the biggies was the Townshend Acts of 1667 and 68. These were a series of laws aimed to correct behavior and demonstrate Parliament's authority to impose taxes. Among other things, these laws collectively were meant to raise revenue to cover the salaries of colonial governors and judges so that they would remain loyal to the English. They were intended to make it easier to enforce existing trade regulations, and they were also an attempt to punish, especially New York, for noncompliance with the Quartering Act. These acts were passed in direct response to the failure of the Stamp Act. So, taxes were placed on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea, commodities that were supposed to be imported only from Britain. By March of 1770, most had been repealed in the face of colonial rejection, with the exception of tea. And as a side note, the date of repeal was March 5th, 1770. That's the same day as the Boston Massacre, which had been provoked by the Townshend Acts. For the next 3 years, there was relative peace and harmony between the colonies and the mother country. Trade was very good for both sides, except for tea. And that's where the problem began. For Lord North, Frederick North, the Prime Minister of England from 1770 to 1782, that's where the problem began for the colonials, and that's where the problem began for the British East India Company. I've not forgotten about them. Here's where they more fully fit into our story today. Anyway, the colonists had responded to the tea tax by smuggling Dutch tea through Rhode Island. Tea was a big commodity for the East India Company, but they had fallen on hard times and they were on the verge of bankruptcy, with heavy debt owed to the English government. In fact, the East India Company had shipped 17 million pounds of tea with a street value of 2 million British pounds to England. 17 million pounds. It was rotting in warehouses. The excess inventory was in large part due to the American boycott of tea. In an effort to avoid total disaster, the East India Company petitioned Parliament for a loan and to readjust the tea tax to allow it to compete directly against the Dutch. Now, North's response was aggressive, and frankly, it was shrewd. I mean, don't think of yourself as an American colonial right now. Think of yourself as just an omniscient third party, an observer to this, right? There's this triangle going on. You've got the East India Company on one side, and then you've got Lord North representing the king and the government on the other side, and then you've got the colonials, right? So North has a part to play in this. He's trying to keep the government from losing all of the money that they've loaned to this East India Company. So he decided to grant them a monopoly on the American tea business. And by this, he figured he would allow the East India Company to sell directly to the colonies without working through the London merchants. See, the way it was supposed to go was the East India Company would ship tea from Asia. They'd ship that into London, where it would be taxed and cataloged, and then that tea could go out from London to the colonies. But North figured, why don't we just let them sell direct? That would decrease the cost of doing business. They would also receive a rebate of the tax that had been paid when they brought the tea into England. I mean, do you see the inefficiency in obtaining commodities for the consumer here? And the added burden of taxation all along the way. Everybody's getting their cut. And it's only really benefiting the mother country at the expense of everyone else. Even this merciful plan was ultimately to benefit England, not the East India Company or the American colonies. Under this setup, the colonials would be buying their tea for half the cost of an Englishman. The cost would be reduced from 20 shillings a pound to 10. That was a cost that was even less than they were paying for the Dutch tea. I mean, everybody would win, except the Dutch, which there's another whole discussion there. But the catch, or the rub, to this plan would be on the American side. Under this plan, North would keep the 3 pence per pound tax in place on the colonials. So the East India Company would make money, England would collect taxes, and the Americans would get very cheap tea. But there would be a small tax associated with their very cheap cost of tea. If it was cheap, who'd care, right? That's what North figured. Who cares? But he had advisors in Parliament telling him it's the principle over the profit. The colonials will never buy the tea if you leave any tax whatsoever on it. he didn't listen. He thought cost was the issue, and he thought this was a winning argument, and he was wrong. In May of 1773, Lord North's Tea Act became law, and later that year, the East India Company shipped 600,000 pounds of tea to commissioners in 4 ports: Boston, New York, Philly, and Charleston. Now, we're not going to spend time talking about Charleston today, but we will talk about the other 3. Well, we'll mention 2, and then we'll talk about Boston. How's that? So let's set the stage. In Boston, the Clark family was the second largest tea importer, and they were awaiting their ship, the William, which was one of the 4 ships heading to Boston. The largest company in Boston, so you've got the Clark family. The largest company in Boston was owned by the Hutchinson brothers, and they were the sons of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. So now you've got 2 very prominent families, pro-English tea type families in Boston. Anyway, the ship, the William, was lost at sea just off Cape Cod, but the cargo was saved. So the Clarks have tea. But having inventory was not the only hurdle to success, and we'll find that out in just a few minutes. So put a finger in that page while we turn to the next. So we've got some colonials with a vested interest in the promotion of a thriving tea business. But all along the coast, other colonials, angry colonials, argued that to accept any of this tea with even a small tax would be to recognize Parliament's right to tax them without their consent, and that could not be allowed to happen. So New York and Philadelphia reacted very quickly and aggressively, and they were able to successfully reject the tea shipments and send them back to England. There was another ship that had arrived at Annapolis, and that was burned. Boston is the interesting story here. On November 28th, the Dartmouth entered Boston Harbor. There was a quick response on November 29th in the Boston Gazette. And it said this, quote, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, the worst of plagues, the detested tea shipped for this port by the East India Company is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself and prosperity, is now called upon to meet at Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock this day, at which time the bells will ring to make a united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive measure of administration." End quote. So, translation, the anti-tears were having none of this. Remember, the governor had a vested interest in the tea business, and he refused to send the tea back. He also knew he had a powerful British force in the city that would back him up against the Patriots. And by now, 2 more ships had arrived. Hutchinson demanded the tea be unloaded and the paperwork completed. He ordered the harbor guns to open fire if the Dartmouth attempted to leave port before the duty was paid. I mean, how tense is this getting? He tells the British forces that were stationed there to simply open fire with their cannons if that Dartmouth started leaving the harbor. He is determined to have this tea unloaded. So unlike New York and Philly, where the customs officers had resigned their positions, in Boston, they refused. In fact, they retreated to Castle William in Boston Harbor. That was the British military castle. And it would get more difficult for everybody because they did this. There was an entire legal code that had to be followed, and it was about to be manipulated and exploited by everybody. Because the Dartmouth had made it into the harbor, the captain was required to register it and its cargo with the customs house. He could not leave until he was cleared to do so. So now the guy's in the harbor, he's got to register, and he's not allowed to leave until they tell him he can. Also, according to trade laws, the duties had to be paid within 20 days or the tea would be confiscated by the customs agents. So not only can he not leave the harbor, he's got the Patriots saying, don't unload that tea. We're not allowing you to unload the tea. He's got the governor saying, you're unloading the tea. He's got the custom agents that have fled from their offices, and they're now hiding out with the British in the fort. And then furthermore, even if he was able to leave, he could not re-enter England with that cargo. So he was essentially stuck in limbo. Governor Hutchinson was pretty shrewd to have leveled those guns on the Dartmouth, wasn't he? So time was ticking. You've only got 20 days. The Patriots were convinced that once the tea was unloaded, it would invariably find its way into the homes of the people. I mean, that was really the sticking point, right? And that could not be allowed to happen because then they would lose. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, the other two ships, were held under guard at Griffin's Wharf. And as December 17th approached, the day the Dartmouth would have to be unloaded, tension mounted. There were attempts to reconcile the situation, but both sides, those that refused the tea and those that wanted to accept the tea, were stubborn. The bottom line for the Patriots was principle. The main argument for those who would accept the tea, mainly the consignees and the commissioners, was that if the cargo was refused and sent back to England, it would be confiscated, thereby ruining the merchants. So the guy's stuck in the harbor, he can't unload. By law, he's supposed to unload and have his paperwork finished and taxes paid within 20 days. He's not allowed to unload. He's not allowed to leave the harbor. And even if he did leave the harbor, he's only going to return to England, more than likely, to have everything confiscated. So at any rate, on December 16th, the day before the deadline, 7,000 people overflowed the Old South Church. Think about that, 7,000 people in those days. They came from all over the colony. 7,000 people gathered. How many buildings are you aware of that can hold 7,000 people in just a normal town? You know, even if it's a big church. I mean, how big a crowd was this? Think about this too, the imposition on the locals. How did you feed these people? Where did they pee? How did they eat? What did they drink? I mean, this is an incredible amount of people. This was a big deal. The goal was to persuade Governor Hutchinson to release the ships. He wasn't even in town. He, by this time, had traveled 6 miles away to his house in Milton. So now everybody's getting desperate. Well, Francis Roch, the son of the Dartmouth's owner, agreed to sail back to England if the governor would just allow him to leave the harbor. So he was sent to Milton to get the okay. I mean, it's kind of funny. He's basically saying, we're going to surrender all of this cargo and lose our butts on this trip, but just let us go, for goodness sakes. And then he's the guy they make go that 6 miles to Milton to get the okay. Well, long story short, Hutchinson refused. And this response set in motion a chain of events that are infamous and synonymous with rebellion and revolutionary pride in America. Samuel Adams proclaimed, "Gentlemen, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country." And there were shouts, "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight," as the crowd quickly exited the church and moved toward Griffin's Wharf. John Hancock shouted, quote, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes," end quote. And to me, no scarier statement could have been made in that kind of an environment than "let every man do what is right in his own eyes." Do you want to be in a frenzied crowd when someone yells that? I mean, to me personally, that's a dangerous statement to have made. But now it was Paul Revere's turn at the dramatic. He had organized a group of young men and masqueraded them as Indians. I mean, legend has it that they were masqueraded as Mohawks, which I find weird because Mohawks were hundreds of miles away. But at any rate, they had masqueraded themselves and dressed as Mohawks, and they wrapped themselves in blankets, and they carried axes and pistols. They were assigned about 50 men per ship, and they boarded, and they were very polite. They requested the keys to the hold so that they could avoid unnecessary damage to the ships. I mean, obviously, under these circumstances, 50 guys dressed like Indians with, axes and pistols, the crews obliged and gave them the keys. The night was very still and quiet, and it was recorded that the initial blows of the axes on the chests were heard well into the city itself. It must have been an eerie feeling. After 3 hours, 342 chests of tea had been dumped into the harbor. The goal was to admonish Parliament, not the ships or the crews. So when the dumping was done, the ships were swept clean, and the first mates were asked to make sure that it was noted that nothing but the tea had been molested. If the governor would have backed down, the tea would have been sent back to England. But of course, the merchants would still have lost their shirts. To get an idea of how much tea this was, I didn't look this up. I did read this a couple of years ago in another account. It was a low tide. There was so much tea that was dumped from these ships that it actually was coming up out of the water. The mound was so high in some places. That's a lot of tea. Anyways, because of the large crowds that had gathered to watch, the guns never fired on the tea dumpers. This action was not as universally popular as we tend to think in our day, the way it's reenacted in our popular history. Some saw this as an attack not on Parliament, but private merchants just doing their jobs and their private property. So while the Patriots celebrated, a lot of people were pretty ticked off, pretty embarrassed about this. And many in England, even William Pitt, a true friend of the colonials, condemned this act. The prevailing view was that something had to be done to punish them. So how does the context change your view on the Boston Tea Party? I mean, does it change your view at all? Is the destruction of someone else's private property justified when making a political statement? Not if it's your political statement, but if it's your private property, if it's in your neighborhood, if you're going to assume the loss. So I left a lot on the table with that story. We'll definitely give it more context when we get there chronologically. There's a lot more to this notorious event than I gave you today. But in terms of the subject that we're talking about, mercantilism, you see how all of the various schemes are visible in the Boston Tea Party. The English government did what it needed to support its own best interest, at the expense of everybody else. The East India Company, the owner of the Dartmouth, the colonials and their pride, and again, you can even throw in the Dutch. It offered a solution to the East India Company because its failure would have cost the English government a lot of money. They had loaned the company a lot and they needed to recoup their money. It needed to enforce the laws that had been on the books for a long time and also impress upon the colonials that they did indeed have authority over them. Centralized authority. They put together a plan, centrally, that was meant to appease the colonials, provide cheap tea, and collect taxes, that failed to take into account the people that it would most affect. They put together a plan that would circumvent the Dutch trade. They had the various laws in place that even dealt with the concepts of timeliness for unloading merchandise, paying taxes promptly, and levied harsh penalties against returning with cargo intended for sale. I mean, this could prevent smuggling and encourage reporting of merchants who were in danger of losing their business because someone on the other side of the trade route had smuggled and now refused your cargo. You see how nice and neat a little package this is. And none of this appears to resemble capitalism or the free market system. The ideas of personal interest, property rights, efficiency, supply and demand were all subjected to the whims of the state, at the expense of the market, at the expense of efficiency, at the expense of personal interest. When I think about the Boston Tea Party in this light, I'm far more interested to try to understand the rest of the storyline, the context behind the popular history, the development of the English mercantile system, the growth of the American colonies. I know I threw a lot out there today. I hope it helps to understand what happened on a deeper level. I hope it helps to put some context and meaning, some application to some of the things that we're experiencing as a culture today. We live in tough times, to be sure. I think we all need as many tools as possible to navigate the sheer volume of information and chaos that we're witnessing. We really did look at the bookends today. The definition and the rationale behind mercantilism and early proponents of it, like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, as the left bookend, and the Boston Tea Party as the right. What we'll work on moving forward is all the stories in the middle, but those are stories for other days. And until then, I hope our time together this day really did make the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.